Okay, so what do we know about the Roman government? Anything? Anyone want to start us off?
But yeah, plebes, right? That's an insult. That's a derogatory term we use today. Someone's a pleb. It just really means a commoner, a laborer. In reality, it means you're not aristocratic, but you're not a slave either. And so when you really look at these terms, patrician and plebeian, you're really just looking at the commoner versus the aristocrat. So don't be confused by that specific terminology at all. So that way you can easily compare and contrast it to Athens, right? Because that whole dynamic, that movement from, hoplite warriors to Theat rowers onto radical democracy is born of the conflict between those two classes, the aristocrats, the privileged classes and the non-privileged classes. Same is true with the French Revolution. So we can compare those now and see how they overlap. Rome understood well Athenian radical democracy. The Mediterranean world had their eye on Greece, so Rome knew about the Greeks before the Greeks knew about the Romans, let's put it that way. And your original kings of Rome were Etruscans, and they were huge fans of Greek culture and art and language. So the Romans are very aware of what has already gone wrong with radical democracy. And this is very similar to what we say our founding fathers, right? Our founding fathers looked at Greek and Roman government and wanted to avoid certain things. They wanted to create a balance of powers to avoid corruption, to avoid not only radical democracy, but also avoid the pitfalls of someone staying in power too long and becoming a dictator. There's actually a really fine balance there. So we saw the problems Athens had with radical democracy, and so we see some early warnings. If we have a country or an institution that you just decide out of the goodness of your own heart to start a corporation, and you have 100 employees, and you're like, I'm going to make this a transparent and democratic institution. I'm going to let everybody vote on what we do and how we market and our budget, and we can see really quickly with the model of Athens that could go wrong. It could go horribly wrong. You have various interests, and on any one day, you might get a change in vote. On one day, you might have one marketing plan if it was a democratic corporation, and the next day you might have a totally different marketing plan. They might decide to change the marketing plan halfway through it after you spent 10 grand on it, so real problems. Historians these days say that radical democracy points out the fickleness and the changingness of the masses. Right? So when we say the masses, we don't mean individuals, right? Even though individuals make up the masses. A lot of historians and people in law and government really believe, sociologists, psychologists, the whole 9 yards, really believe that groups of people act different than individuals. I mean, most of you probably could kind of understand that. A mob mentality, yeah, very good. And the French take it even farther and often talk about the folly of two, folie à deux. And they have a big thing about how when two people get together, they'll act totally different than if they were apart. And they might decide to go radical or assassinate someone or steal something or start a new religion together, whereas they might not if they were apart. So very interesting dynamics. When you study government, really, in the longitudinal sense, like in the long term, you're looking at human behavior, and you have to be really honest with yourself about human behavior. You have to say, humans aren't blank slates. They have certain tendencies. We have certain issues we will run into. If our institution is set up a certain way, we will have these problems, So we're learning the lessons of government. And so Rome already knows what we know about Athens, really. They already know about that. So here's Rome in Italy. Most of you know where that is. Some of our major players. Of course, here is Athens over here in Sparta. Not very far from Rome. Your Mediterranean Sea here. When we talk about Caesar going up into Gaul, we're talking about France. France was known as Gaul. And we're mainly concerned with the Italian peninsula. Important river you should know. Aside from the major river that runs through Rome, there is actually a small river, which we don't know where it is now, that lines the top of Italy, known as the Rubicon. And the Rubicon was your boundary line of Rome proper, once they controlled the Italian peninsula. And the Rubicon, if you cross the Rubicon with a military unit, then you've just declared war on Rome. So when Julius Caesar left to go basically pillage Gaul for Rome and send treasures back, he had actually already violated many laws of Rome. So he was going to be tried once he got back in Rome. So what he decided to do instead is take over Rome, right? A lot of us know about this. We call it the beginning of the empire. Rome was already an empire long before Julius Caesar. We just didn't call it that. So when Julius Caesar crossed this river with his military unit, he declared war on Rome, and he had to basically bring a coup and become dictator once he did that sort of thing. So you can see where when we say Rome, we really just don't mean the city. At a certain point, we mean the entire Italian peninsula. And then a little bit later, we mean even more. And at a certain point, we'll actually have an east, and Rome will have encompassed this entire area here as well. Parts of North Africa, as you can see actually here. So when we say Rome, we don't always mean the city of Rome. Sometimes we mean the Roman Empire. Sometimes we mean all of Italy. Sometimes we mean almost all of Europe, depending on what era we're in. So in this first zone, I won't linger on this too long. It's the shadowy, distant past. It's the archaic Rome under the kings. It lasts till about 500 BC. This is that monarchical phase. Like the Greeks, the Romans came out after the last 7 kings. The last king was Tarquin, and his son committed an offense against another noblewoman. He raped her, actually. And so other nobles in Rome decided to get rid of the king. And after that great civil war, there were no more kings. So like the Greeks, when the Greeks entered their archaic phase, they already didn't want a monarchy. They were already like, no, we're not setting up a king. No way. We've already been abused by kings. We still have an aristocracy. We still have various classes, but no more kings. So very similar to Greece with the Romans. And then the Roman Republic begins. This is oftentimes the most glorified aspect of Roman government. The Republic is set up. You can almost compare it to our own Republic. You have people who have executive powers at the top, like the consuls and the censors. You actually have a religious head. And you have people who manage the cities and the provinces, sewage canals. You have people who handle the treasury. And so the whole system of government, all those government offices are kind of on their own hierarchy in the Roman Republic. It's a neat little system. It's kind of a compact way to study Roman government because they organize it so nicely. If you really want to get into Roman government and study it more than we are this week, it's packaged quite nicely, and I can recommend some books for you if you would like. Now, the Roman Republic disintegrates, and the Roman civil wars are the cause of this disintegration. What happens is you have this thing called super generals, and Caesar was one of the last great super generals. And so during these Roman civil wars, you would actually have generals who had these large bodies of troops, and because you would go out and pillage to make more money, to bring treasures back to Rome, the leader of a unit or several units, like a super general, would actually make their centurions and soldiers very wealthy from pillaging, from giving them a bunch of booty and wealth. So troops ended up being more loyal to their leader. And so that's what a super general is. And so this starts a civil war because you have these different super generals who are battling for supremacy. And Caesar was really the last of those. Caesar sort of unifies everyone, even though he creates a coup. He kind of unifies and stops the civil wars. But he's assassinated, as we all know. That's the one thing about Roman history most of us know, is that Caesar is stabbed to death on the Senate floor. And the Roman Empire begins. His adopted son, Octavian Augustus, is the first emperor. And once again, remember, even though we call this the Roman Empire, Rome was an empire long before. They had already started conquering the Italian peninsula and beyond. So when we say Roman Empire, know that they were actually already empire. It's just a term. It just means now you have emperors who are heading the government instead of a republic. That's all that means. Okay, so explain how the Roman government separated assembly powers. Their basic form of their government, here's kind of their hierarchy. This is this little symbol. It's an upside down triangle, and at the top you have consuls on the wide part. It shows you that the consuls, even though there are only 2, they have the most power. So inverted pyramid of power, you could say. And then you have the Senate, And the consuls often, lead the Senate. And then you have the assembly body here. Now, you have more people in the assembly. You have most of your population in the assembly. You have even fewer senators, and you only have 2 consuls. But see how that power is structured? So it's kind of like our own government. We give power to executive. It's a representative government, just like our own. It's a republic. So we vote in consuls. We don't necessarily vote in who gets to the Senate with the Roman Republic. And so a lot of people say that the Roman Republic preserved many institutions that the Athenians did not. Here's why. The consulship is a preservation of the monarchical branch. Consuls really are executive powers like a king would be. They'll lead you in war, they advise the Senate. They're real executive powers, right? The Senate is the aristocratic branch. And of course, with the Roman Republic, you only had patricians in the Senate. So it's literally true. It's not just symbolically the aristocratic branch. And the assembly is your democratic branch of government. So here we have monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy in one system. That's something the Romans were very proud of. Some of these offices could only be held by patricians. Some eventually were open to plebeians. Unlike the Athenians, aristocratic privileges maintained with the Romans, a balance of power. There are 4 assemblies instead of just 1. Your 4 bodies, you have the Senate, only aristocrats. They're the ones who advise other assemblies and draft bills, essentially. The centuriate assembly, that word is very similar to centurion, and that'll tell you pretty much what they are. They're an assembly of the military. And they decide military matters. So already with this separation of power, you can see your Athenian assembly is split up into several parts. Why would you have all your citizens vote on military matters, The Romans are like, no, we'll have soldiers and senators vote on and discuss military matters, not just every citizen. So you have your own assembly for military matters. Plebeian assembly, matters that have to do with your commoners. It's your most numerous population, the plebeians. And a tribal assembly is made of tribal heads. They determine, initially they were made of tribal heads, but in reality, depending on what phase you're in, tribal assembly actually dictated what was going on in the provinces in general. And the provinces were organized under what main city was in that province. So really, when you look at tribal assemblies, eventually it just meant everything but Rome. So other cities throughout Italy, they would decide policy. So it's already more advanced than Athenian government because they separated powers into various assemblies. It seems more appropriate. What I was talking about, the really neat package of Roman government, it's easy to learn, even though it's complex. They package it really nicely. This is what I'm talking about, the cursus honorum. This is the cursus honorum. It means the course of honor. So when you go and get your bachelor's degree, you take many courses and you eventually get to the final goal. Same thing here. There was a ladder of offices. So you couldn't just be like a politician today. If you're ambitious and popular, you can go run for president, if you're the right age and that sort of thing. You have funding and everything behind you. You don't have to serve in others' intermediary political roles, right? But with the cursus honorum, it was set, and this is kind of a neat little genius idea, is that you actually had to serve lower political roles for a year, maybe. Maybe it only lasts for a year, a quaestor. Then you move up to more executive roles, more important roles. And eventually you could be elected as a consul. And you don't stay a consul forever. But once you get to the higher ranks and you are a patrician, then you might be able to have a seat in the Senate. And so some of these are only open to patricians, and you can see where the plebeians can only go so high. An official dictator, we usually think of a dictator as someone who is illegally in power, but a dictator is actually a temporary power. So if you're in a state of war and you need a strong central leader, then you can have a dictator voted in. And the power only lasts for like 6 months, and they have to give it back or they're arrested. But they can have absolute control of Rome and of the military in a time of war.